Hello, everyone. Gary Price here, and it's time once again for an open access interview. Today, we're headed to Baltimore to talk with Sayeed Choudhury from Johns Hopkins University. We would like to, or I would like to, congratulate him on recently being named and installed as a member of the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services National Museum and Library Services Board. So congratulations, Sayeed. Now, a little bit more about yourself coming directly from you. What do you do and how did you get there?
All right, thanks, Gary. I appreciate that. So I am the Associate Dean for Research Data Management here at the Sheridan Libraries at Johns Hopkins. I'm also the Hopson Director of the Digital Research and Curation Center. The fact that I have two titles conveys that I have a range of responsibilities or roles going all the way from R&D to administration, operations, things of that nature. So rather than talk about specific accomplishments, I think the most useful thing might be to talk about the kinds of opportunities or experiences I've had.
Okay.
So I'm actually trained as an engineer, so I come to the library with a different background and a different viewpoint. And my advisor in engineering school was an unusual and interesting person. He's now the provost at Penn State. And he used to think of engineering as a liberal art. And I didn't understand what that meant until he explained it to me. And he basically said that the math and the statistics and the computations are just methods. But engineers, if they want to really be the most effective, need to look at people, products, and processes, and the workflows that connect them. So I've tried to think about a lot of what I've done in the library world or over the course of my career in libraries with that lens. And I think I've been fortunate to work with lots of different kinds of people. So obviously just the people that I work with directly here at Hopkins, but if you think about even the researchers that I've had the pleasure of working with, it spans medieval French to astronomy, the humanities to the sciences, the kinds of funding sources that we've been fortunate enough to receive also span sort of high risk NSF programs all the way to implementation grants. From a foundation, for example, the most recent one being the Slum Foundation and IMLS. So there's a diversity of communities that I work with, a diversity of different types of stages of developing technology to help those communities. And I think that that's given me maybe a little bit broader view in some sense than I might have otherwise had. And recently I've actually had the pleasure of starting to work a lot more with the publishing world, which I think is particularly relevant when talking about open access.
As we begin 2017, where are we in awareness and use and participation, in your view, with open access?
Before maybe I dive into where we are today, I think it's a little worthwhile to step back to where we were yesterday, so to speak. And if you go back certainly 10 years, maybe even longer, some of the earlier conversations around open access, around institutional repositories were very ambitious. There were things stated about revolutionizing scholarly communication, changing the way that libraries work with faculty, dealing with the escalating costs of serials, so on. So I think a lot of the early at least ambition or potential or promise has still not been realized. So we have to keep that in mind when we sit down and engage the faculty at any institution, even including Hopkins. Because one question that I think is a fair question that we get in some cases is, you've been talking about this for a while, and what happened? The fact that we don't have it now, the sky hasn't fallen, I continue to do my work, I continue to get access to the resources I need. Yes, I understand you have budgetary pressures, but every school has budgetary pressures. So the sense of urgency that maybe we began these conversations with, it's a little hard to argue that now, given that it's been such a long time. So if you come to today, I think many more faculty are aware of the issues around open access or the drivers for open access. They are generally speaking, perhaps more sympathetic, but I would say that I don't think Hopkins faculty are unique in that I don't think they're driving this process. They're not the ones asking for this to happen. When they hear about it, when they understand that it's being discussed in specific terms, they want to be part of the conversation. But I think relatively few cases across our landscape where the faculty come together through the faculty senate or through a set of champions saying, I really want this to happen, and then ask the library and the administration to get involved.
For people who don't think about this, talk about this on a daily basis, is it somewhat confusing? How do I get started? Where do I put my materials? What kind of materials can I put in? They might be hearing about so many different projects, and it often, I think, might be confusing, and where they'll just say, just forget about it.
Right. Yeah, I think you've raised a legitimate point or a legitimate concern. It's no surprise to anyone that our faculty and researchers have very little time on the margins. So anything that is added to their plate needs to be done so in a way that is not only respectful, but adheres to that idea that they don't have a lot of time, and these things need to be simple. So tied to that, I think, is a fundamental shift that's taking place that I think needs to take place. Again, I think in the early days, there was a lot of discussion or belief or conversation around put your materials into the institutional repository, and that'll become the place where all these open access materials reside, along with library collections and other kinds of things. So a couple of institutions or a few institutions have been fairly successful in building up a sense of energy and community around their institutional repositories. I'm sure there are others, but I think of places like Illinois or Michigan, for example. But if you think about the larger context of how people work and what they need to do, there are important questions like discovery. Are you going to go to your institutional repository as the first place to find your research? Highly unlikely. People still use Google, will continue to use Google, we know that, but there are tools that publishers put out, of course, for their materials, and many faculty use those. So, was it realistic to expect that people would start coming to the institutional repository as a place for starting their discovery or continuing along their path to discovery? So the shift that I think is taking place, which needs to take place, is the institutional repository is one node in a larger landscape. Even in terms of repositories, there are disciplinary repositories, there are maybe even society-based repositories. There's a host of repositories. And more importantly, there are lots of other places where content is managed and where content can be discovered. And we need to think about what we're doing as part of a greater whole, not as the place to begin something.
Speaking of discovery, do you think the library community as a whole should be doing more to make things discoverable, no matter where it's found, be it Google or in a more traditional library research tool?
Yeah. So I'm going to quote Herbert von de Saint-Paul, because it's always a good idea to quote Herbert von de Saint-Paul. Yeah. He gave a presentation not that long ago at a CNI, where he said something that he has said many times before, but in the sort of modern day or current context, it was a reminder to me and an affirmation maybe to me. And he basically said, we need to stop being repository-centric and we need to start being resource-centric. And so, the fundamental premise, at least the way I took it, was that we keep talking about putting things into repositories and then connecting them and building discovery around them. Rather, we need to think about there will be these web resources that exist in some place, some of them in repositories, some of them in other places, and we need to make connections between those resources. Linked data obviously comes to mind when you hear something like this, but I think it's really critical that we as a community, and I mean we being libraries, publishers, researchers, so on, begin to embrace this idea that the where something goes is not as important as how it gets connected to all these other kinds of things. And Hopkins is now a member of the Ivy Plus, which is Ivy League, Chicago, Duke, Hopkins, MIT, and Stanford. I think I got that right. And at a meeting of the library IT directors from those institutions, Rob Carolano from Columbia was the one who said, we need to spend a lot more time treating our data, describing our data, creating the right data models around it, than building interfaces or tools for discovery. Let's make the data prepared in a manner that it makes it easier to discover rather than worrying so much about what kind of discovery tools we build.
Where are we at in terms of open access for non-textual material, meaning research data itself, multimedia materials, and so forth?
Yeah, really good question. I think about this a lot because there are these conversations around open access. Again, at Hopkins, in the local context, we are having conversations around this, but it's around publications. We seem to always start with publications, and I understand the reasons for that. There are some very good reasons for that. But if after all those somewhat ambitious goals we might have had for open access, the clearest signal that I seem to hear or seems to resonate with the faculty is broader dissemination. Not getting caught up in the economics of it, the business aspects of it, or the relevance of libraries or changes in scholarly communication. It's simply that I'm doing work that I think is important, and I would like people to know about it. In that sense, the publication is often the end of the story of a researcher or a research team's journey. There's all those other stages of work that get captured in preprints, in data, in blog posts and video posts, or whatever you wish to call them, where much of that is actually already open. One of the things I think about, one of the projects we've been working with for many years is the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. This is a large, not only astronomy, but it has great connections to the general public as well. Large open data collection. It's been open since the beginning. It continues to be open. They have every intention of keeping it open. So what are we as libraries doing to curate those open data collections? The Sloan Digital Sky Survey has been cited thousands of times now. We still grapple with metrics and how do you assess whether something has intrinsic value or long-term value. I don't think there are too many people who would question that the Sloan Digital Sky Survey is an important reference collection now. Yet think of how, and we, being Hopkins and colleagues at Chicago, have put in a lot of effort in terms of trying to think about preserving and curating these data. But as a community, how much effort are research libraries spending on these already open collections of data that have become important reference tools or collections, have tools that need to be sustained over time, whereas we are spending a tremendous amount of energy talking about publications where, for obvious reasons, there are established players in terms of the publishers, it's established infrastructure, and so on and so on. I sometimes honestly don't understand why there's so much effort being spent on the publication side relative to the data side.
Wouldn't you agree that there's some marketing aspect that's kind of out of whack here? In other words, there's all this great material, yet this broader dissemination kind of gets stopped right after the resource is created?
Right. Yeah, I would agree. And I think one of the clear reasons why is the reward structure for faculty. Their tenure review cases are still largely, if not wholly, dependent on their publication track record. So there are those incentives and rewards in our system that are still the same as they were 10, 15, 50, 100 years ago. So that's important. That's an obvious reason why the publication plays a much larger role. But again, I come back to that argument that if the main driver for open access is greater dissemination, there's so much other kinds of content out there that fall into that category of greater dissemination. And the faculty are less familiar and comfortable with the mechanisms of dealing with those kinds of content than there are publications.
I can't let the topic of broader dissemination go by without asking you your views at this point on a lot of what we've seen regarding altmetrics.
Yeah, I think altmetrics can play an important role in just what I just described about the reward and incentive system. So we can say all we want that we don't want it to be simply your publication track record, but then we need some kind of framework, rigorous, subjective framework, to be able to say, you created, for example, you created these data and they were more impactful than the data that that person over there created. That's something we have to be able to answer. And you know, things like downloads and so on seem very mechanical. So altmetrics, I believe, are one possible pathway to get those kinds of more rich, nuanced ways of generating or measuring impact on non-traditional kinds of outputs, but maybe even on publications too. But I will add, you know, the jury in some cases or some ways is still out. There's been evidence to show that, you know, more Twitter, more tweets, and you know, more Facebook posts or whatever don't change the citation or the impact of the articles themselves. When everybody can make a comment on something, and you can get attention that way, it's very tempting to continue to sort of seek out those opportunities. But I think we need more you know, case studies or real world stories of, here's how we used those alternative channels to get our word out, to disseminate our word, and here's the tangible impact that it had. And if altmetrics can help us do that, great. But if not, we're just counting other things that may or may not have direct relevance.
Use the word sustainability. So let's talk a little bit about funding. How should the library community, the publishing community be going about that?
Right. Yeah, I think one of the great advantages that libraries and, you know, other cultural heritage institutions can bring to the picture is a base level of funding and resources. And I don't just mean, you know, money, I mean people, I mean infrastructure and so on, to sustain the kinds of things we're doing. But I think that there's a couple of concerns that I have in this context. One, over the past few years, ARL libraries have become much better, or maybe that's not the right word, much more successful in securing grants. And Hopkins is no exception in that regard. So I've been the PI or director of many grants, and they're wonderful things. And we always try to make them align very closely with our strategic priorities and our long-term goals and our existing plans. Having said that, we all know that that's a very difficult alignment to couple entirely and to keep it as close as possible. Grants often allow us to do more exploratory kinds of things or prototype things or demonstrate whether something might work or not. But working with grants takes a certain amount of effort and resources as well. This was some years ago, so it may not be true anymore. I think it was 2 provosts ago at Hopkins. I was at a meeting where he was talking about grants, and he said it takes more than $1 to cover the costs associated with one grant dollar. So you actually lose money every time you generate a grant. Now, you know, it was an interesting conversation. Some people said that's not a problem, right? You know, we're a research institution, that's what we're supposed to be doing. But as a provost, he has a certain responsibility to track those things in a very, you know, financial, administrative way. And his point was that grants actually introduce a lot of burden or a lot of extra resources, new staff, and so on and so on. I think that's true of libraries. If you're managing grants, if you're managing funds, fundraising, you know, donor relations, all those things, that takes time and energy and resources too. If those things don't ultimately get rolled into the kinds of services and infrastructure that are supported by our base budget, that's a problem, because suddenly you have a series of interesting one-offs, and they aren't coming together into this cohesive whole that is the library, or that is a press, or that is a publisher, or is a museum, and so on. So the other seductive aspect of all these grants is that they are opportunities to get out and talk about your work, opportunities to get out and publish, opportunities to do those things. Those are all useful and important things to do. But if they detract, again, from that base mission of building infrastructure to sustain and support these kinds of services, that can be a problem. And I think our community, quite frankly, is grappling with this right now. We have a lot of things that I hear about. I don't necessarily always hear, and we've been guilty of this too. I don't necessarily hear how they rolled into a production environment. I don't hear how they ended up supporting other communities other than the one for which they were originally intended. The whole point of infrastructure is that many people can use it for many different uses. And if we keep going very deep with these small communities or single projects and don't bring them into a cohesive whole, then the big advantage that we bring from a sustainability perspective is not being leveraged.
You've been hearing about linked data now for a long time.
Yes.
From your perspective, where do we stand with it? Is it a thing, or is it maybe still a thing, or is it not going to be a thing?
Yeah, we have been hearing about it for a long time, and you can argue that Tim Berners-Lee actually talked about it when the web was launched.
Right.
I think what's happened over time is the barrier to entry is getting lowered. At the same time, sort of the awareness and understanding of it is rising. And that's important. I think early on, quite frankly, very few people even knew what it was. Then you started moving into more people know about it, but they don't really know how it works. And then some people coming along and saying, this is how you would build, a semantic graph of something, and very complex, very difficult, and so on. So I'd mentioned Herbert. One of the projects we've been working on recently is something called RMAP. And fundamentally, excuse me, it is an attempt to lower the barrier to entry to creating linked data kinds of graphs and resources. And we based it on the object reuse and exchange protocol that he and Carl launched, and many people contributed to, of course. And I recently saw him, and I was a little worried or concerned, I guess, that he might feel like we somewhat dishonored the ORE protocol by simplifying it, flattening it, so on. But as part of the exchange, he basically said, if this helps with adoption, then I'm all for it. Having a protocol that is richer and has more capabilities, but is not as widely adopted, may not be as helpful as one that loses some of that richness, but is easier to use. The other aspect that I think is important in all this is the techniques and the tools are getting better. So one of the things that people often talk about with, so in the 90s, I guess, I think it was, IBM, of course, built that computer that beat Garry Kasparov. And that was pure computation. It just cranked through all the combinations much faster than any human being could do. And they've continued to work with that over time. At the time, I worked with someone who's a Go player. And he said, they will never build a computer that can beat the best Go players in the world. It's just so much more complex game, so many more combinations, and so on. Well, recently there was, of course, Google had an effort and built a computer that beat one of the best Go players in the world over a 7-game match. And a lot of people think, oh, that's just better computation. That's actually not true. It's better modeling. It's better techniques to walk over graphs and to do that in a strategic and more intelligent way. So the machines are getting better at dealing with the core elements of linked data. Our ability to create linked data is getting easier, and more people are beginning to understand what possibilities exist for it. And you have major players, the publishers, for example, starting to think about this as well. So I think that will converge to it being a thing.
In the beginning, you used the word you're now working more with publishers. Can we talk a little bit more about that? What are your views from your perspective on how the library and the publishing communities can work together in a more useful and productive manner? Yeah,
so the RMAP project in particular has given me more of an opportunity to work with them because IEEE was a partner, Portico was a partner. So we started getting a lot of access to publishers, of course, through both of them. That's in many ways, though, a culmination of, again, a longer-term trajectory. So it was some years ago, almost a decade ago at this point, that a colleague and I conducted a study of open source publishing systems. And that was not dealing with the publishers, but it was our first dipping of the toes in the water of what does it mean to publish something. And we made the recommendation that we actually thought Open Journal System would be the one that had sort of the longest term life, and I think that's come to bear. Mm-hmm. So that was my first kind of interaction with publishing, and more recently I've started, as I said, to work with publishers. I've gone to AAUP, the American Association of University Presses meeting, the Society for Scholarly Publishing meeting, we do presentations around RMAP and so on. And a couple of, I guess, key observations maybe, or points. When I was a student at Hopkins, I didn't know a lot of what happened in the library behind the scenes. As a consumer of the library, I had a certain view and a certain lens, which was incomplete. And now that I've worked here for some years, I have a much more complete and holistic and rich view of how libraries work. I sometimes worry that libraries don't have that rich, complete view of publishers. We are consumers of their outputs, but we don't know fully what happens behind the scenes. How many people are involved, how many different roles are involved, how many different workflows are involved. If you go back to that people, processes, and products and the workflows that connect them that I mentioned early on, mm-hmm. Publishers have an entire set of people, products, and processes and workflows working behind the scenes that most people don't get to see or don't get to interact with unless you work for a publisher. And this is just one person's purely anecdotal observation, of course, but I go to library meetings, and again, because we purchase many things from publishers, they are at our meetings. They come to the ALAs, the ACRLs, the ARL meetings, and so on. And that's a great opportunity to see what's going on behind the scenes in libraries and so on. I go to the publisher meetings, and I don't see a lot of my colleagues. Yeah. And there could be lots of reasons for that, but the moment it dawned on me was the reception at one of, I think it was AAUP maybe, or one of these meetings, where I thought, wow, I don't really know anybody in here. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's a missed opportunity. So I hope that my colleagues in the library community will take more of a chance and an opportunity to go to those publishers' meetings and understand that there may be some things behind the scenes we don't know. But I think once we get a better sense of how each other's organizations have that entire behind the scenes capacity and infrastructure, then that's when we can start to have more meaningful, fruitful conversations about working together.
Sayeed, that's about all the time we have. Thank you so much for this wonderful half an hour or so, and I hope we can do it again very soon.
Thanks, Gary. It's my pleasure.